what do you all think of these powerful billionaires taking on the roles of that where government is failing? And do you see them as ethical leaders?
I mean, I would point back to the era that one reason that I went back to the Gilded Age of Progressive era is you think of an era of unregulated capitalism. You think of the accrual of an enormous amount of capital in the hands of very few. Inequality today is on par with in the U.S. On par with inequality in the 1920s, which is really a product of that era. The journalists in that era, famously, the War of 1898 was called a war generated by the press, and that the Hearst and Pulitzer press were huge parts of sensationalizing that conflict. Whether or not that's an accurate account sort of doesn't matter in the way that we think about it. The press and information can generate conflict or can be part of tamping down conflicts. So I would say we've been there before. This isn't so new. So first, this is always the historian's answer, right? This is not unprecedented, but it doesn't mean don't worry. If you think about it, the progressive era is a product of, those set of reforms are a product of an era in which there was so much excess, including, and perhaps worse, all the ways in which it was weaponized against minoritized populations in the US, right? So the rise of Jim Crow, women still couldn't vote. And even when women get the vote, it's a very imperfect set of power balances in the US. So, but I think one model there would be, the US has, in domestic politics, the US has given up on regulating capitalism in a lot of ways. And people like Elon Musk have had a great, are the product of not just unregulated capitalism, but also gifts of the state to subsidize their efforts, right? And they don't recognize that. So the fact that the US government has funded and subsidized, and states and localities have funded and subsidized building headquarters and all that kind of thing, suggests to me, if you want to go as a policymaker, there's every reason to which you should argue that he absolutely cannot shut down Starlink for his own reasons, that he is beholden to the US government, which has funded much of his work. And there could be ways you could work that out. And if reasonable people could disagree about how these kind of tech billionaires at least should be regulated, but one starting point would be they can't take on foreign policy powers to themselves in any way, shape, or form, right? And then you can negotiate what that should look like. And then in domestic society, a very similar thing. Why is so much power aggregated to corporations as well? If we're thinking about where are power formulations today, there's almost no independent media because they're all conglomerations. Same thing with booksellers. And we can go through every sector of the American economy and think about the ways in which they've congealed into this mass of entities that are also often commingled. So go back to the Gilded Age of Progressive era and think about antitrust laws. There's a whole lot of ways we could think about regulation that could be meaningful. And then I also think in the international sector, the US absolutely, and also this is a Gilded Age model, should be thinking about peer countries' models that work. So if this is a US-centric thing, but social welfare in the US is modeled on German systems that they thought worked in that era. And Americans were unabashed at adopting those things and trying them out in the US. Now it's like, absolutely pilloried in the US to try out the French model of something. And even, to some extent, that's a bipartisan thing, although it's mostly coming from the right. That's absurd. If it works abroad, like gun regulation, it should be attempted in the US. It seems reasonable, right? So there's but part of what is not allowing that is, again, this conglomeration of power in lobbies, interest groups, corporations, and other kinds of groups. How do you fight back against that? It's basically one of our themes for today. It's generational, right? In that era, it did not happen in one generation. It took more than one generation to make significant progress. So, it's on the students here and probably the next generation after the students here to push that ball forward.